So as Todd said, I am Reverend CJ Dunford, and I use they, them pronouns. And I'm currently part-time Chokudo minister at the Buddhist Temple of Marin and minister's assistant at the Berkeley Buddhist Temple. I'd like to thank Reverend Todd and everyone at the temple here for inviting me to speak today. As he said, Reverend Todd and I are good friends, and we've had a lot of nice conversations during our studies at the Institute of Buddhist Studies at the Berkeley Buddhist Temple and during our time preparing and undergoing Chokudo ordination. Last fall, Todd attended an online study session at Berkeley Buddhist Temple where I was presenting an overview of my MA thesis research. A few days after that presentation, he asked me if I'd be willing to share with the temple, and I gladly agreed. So here I am today with you. The focus of my thesis is grounded in academic research, but it's a topic that I feel needs to be shared amongst the Jodo Shinshu communities, and I believe that it can be have both very specific and broad implications. The title of my thesis is Radical Acceptance as a Jodo Shinshu Theology of Liberation for LGBTQ People. For me, to cover all the research would take several hours, so I chose a particular theme to focus on for today's talk, and that's the examination of the self in a holistic and healing way that includes both psychological aspects and the notion of faith in our tradition of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. Little CJ grew up in rural southwestern Virginia in the Appalachian Mountains on the border of West Virginia, and my mom's family is from rural northeastern West Virginia. My parents both met in church, so growing up, our religious identities as Pentecostal, conservative, and Christian was the foundation of our family. And then when I was very young, my parents would both become ministers in our faith. All this means that from the moment I drew my first breath, I was born into a culture, a religious community, and a family that held certain expectations for me, who I was and who I would grow up to be. Frankly, I'm quite proud today to say that I let down every one of those expectations. Everyone expected me to grow up to be a man of God, marry a woman, and have my own family. When I was 8 or 9 years old, a Pentecostal minister prophesied over me while he was praying, saying that God had ordained me to become a great minister and preacher when I grew up. However, in spite of all of these expectations set up around me, I felt pretty strange while I was growing up. Though I didn't express it for fear of judgment or worse, from the age of 4 or 5, I realized that I wasn't only attracted to girls. I also didn't feel like I fit the typical description of a boy either. This led to a lot of repressed feelings of guilt, uncertainty, and discomfort within myself. My church, most of my family, and virtually everyone around me expected me to be something that I didn't want to be. Ultimately, my story isn't all that unique, especially for other queer converts to Jodo Shinshu. Me and a lot of my queer friends and temples have experienced rejection from family, religious abuse from our church, and carry a lot of discomfort, stress, and trauma around our queer sexuality and gender identity. We aren't all out and proud about our queerness either. For each of us, it's a personal decision based on privacy, safety, and many other factors as to how we can be or want to be with our temple, our communities, and our friends. A lot of self-reflection, digging up pain and trauma within myself, alongside conversations with friends and reading more academic literature on common threads of marginalization and other forms of violence, led me to pursue a queer understanding of our teaching. And that's what I hope to touch on just a bit today. From my thesis, I find that a practice of deep self-reflection leading to radical acceptance can be a powerful theological message within Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, informing a robust and resilient psychological self. This creative understanding of selfhood can provide LGBTQ people with resources and coping strategies to address minority stress, negative social and cultural narratives, and the difficult experience of coming out. Additionally, Jodo Shinshu Buddhist religious leadership and pastoral caregivers play a critical role in building temple community as a setting to cultivate cultures that are inclusive, understanding, and affirming of LGBTQ identity. A primary goal of my thesis is to build a foundational theology that can guide such leadership in understanding the needs and concerns of LGBTQ folks. My research also seeks to present a sociological, psychological, and theological understanding of the social and cultural normative pressures that marginalize and often traumatize LGBTQ people while criticizing them from a unique Jodo Shinshu Buddhist perspective. I'd like to start with thinking a little bit about the self. And I think we all carry a lot of perspectives or biases on what the self is. Some of these understandings can be helpful for our healing and our growth. Some of them might be nihilistic, limiting or oppressive to ourselves and to others. So as a mental exercise, I would encourage each of us to take about a minute and think about how we define the self. What are our definitions? And how are they informed by our personal experience, by our faith tradition? How are our perceptions formed by science, literature, or any combination of these other factors? Maybe if you can, write down a few notes thinking about what the self is from your own perspective. The purpose of this exercise isn't to come together or to agree on a definition of defining characteristics. Rather, it's to recognize that our own limited perceptions that we carry with us. I'm not about to try to correct you or affirm your understanding. Rather, I want us to each recognize our biases and what we might cling to as truth. After you have some ideas, take that list and set it aside. And if you can, try to think of them as just one perspective. It's not an absolute truth of what the self actually is. What I want to talk about today are perspectives on the self, and they might align with our personal truths, or they might not. However, I'd like for us all to keep in mind that there's always many ways to understand difficult and sometimes abstract concepts like this one. Okay. So first, I'd like to start off by talking about the psychological self. On this slide, we have some basic psychological perspectives on the self. And the first one is the self that is a theoretical construct. It isn't ultimately a firm, unchanging thing that exists outside of space and time, like a soul, for example. The self is an idea. Secondly, as an idea or a theoretical structure, it holds patterns that influence our perceptions and our actions. It molds and creates our reality. Put another way, it's our subjective experiences that we hold to as truth. And we function in such a way that assumes that the nature of our personal self is universal. That what we experience is also what others experience. This leads us to the third aspect, which is, from a Buddhist perspective, the interdependent self. We might be a distinct individual, but on the other hand, we're embedded within a relational matrix with things that make us up. Our race, our gender, our sexuality, our religious identities, and that extends to our relationships with others, our parents, our children, our ancestors, our coworkers, our sangha, and other communities and relationships. Here we might wonder, and rightfully so, where does the self that is me, CJ, and the other that is you, or our temple communities, our work communities, our school communities, where do one of these things begin and where does the other one end? Is there a firm boundary between the self and the many other selves around me? Psychology and Buddhism would say, maybe in our mind, yes, we are distinct from our community, and yet we are a part of those communities. The boundary between self and other is permeable, flexible, and fluid. We exist in relationship and oftentimes those relationships define how we perceive ourselves. Now, considering the self in relationship, there are certain aspects of the self that are important to know in how we relate to our identities, our self-perception, and how we relate to others. An aspect that I focused on in my research is resiliency, because it's important for determining safety, growth, and healing. In the model that understands resiliency, the self is a kind of lump of clay or Play-Doh. When it's wet, if it's flexible, pliable, and adaptable to change. However, a fragile self is what we get when the clay dries out. Just a little pressure or change in the environment and it breaks. It may crumble or shatter. According to psychologist Judith Herman, when our resiliency is sturdy and flexible, individuals tend to have a strong sense of efficacy, of agency, safety, and personal meaning in life. Resilient individuals have strong sense of goals and dreams and how they wish to live their lives. Resilient selves and people tend to have a sense of trust in their relationships and communities of which they're a part. That they can rely on those communities in times of hardship and adversity. Also crucial to a resilient self is that fundamental needs are met, which provide for a baseline of safety and security, such as food and shelter. The opposite of a resilient self is one that's brittle and fragile, like the dried out clay. Herman says that the lack of resiliency leads to a sense of fragmentation that can lead to a fleeting moment of discomfort or profound experiences of confusion and distress. And when the self breaks down, we usually experience trauma. Here, to put this sense of fragility into context, I'd like to consider some of the troubles that LGBTQ folks face. And to do so, we'll have to consider the idea of stress, specifically minority stress. This concept can be extended and also studied for other minority communities. We could look at racial minority stress, gender minority stress, socioeconomic minority stress, or others, all with their own factors. Looking into these avenues would be a fruitful way of examining our teaching, but for my research, I focused on LGBTQ minority stress, which can be compounded through a model of intersectionality, which takes into account other forms of minority stress, like the other ones I mentioned. Generally speaking, LGBTQ people face extra stress beyond what people face in everyday life, and that stress is related to our queer identity. A few of those stressors are general discrimination, like staring, offhanded comments about heteronormative relationships, such as, do you have a girlfriend? When are you getting married? Etc. Knowing that we will be rejected and treated differently by our families are other factors of stress. We can also be afraid of being rejected by our friends and our communities, whether they be religious, secular, or at work. As a result, we sometimes feel the need to hide or conceal our authentic identities, which can lead to internalized homonegativity. Negative stories and stereotypes also contribute to minority stress about what a queer person is, what we do and say. Some examples include gay men just always being effeminate, being sissies, or being queer going through a phase, or popular expressions of hatred for trans folks because it's unnatural to be a transgender person. I've even heard in some Buddhist communities that trans people are too obsessed with their bodies and aren't practicing Buddhism properly because our gender is inherently empty, which is religious abuse, plain and simple. All of these stressors lead to a negative coping behaviors of self-harm, substance abuse, low esteem, and self-hate. All of these factors combined with other forms of minority stress from race, gender, and economics challenge our ability to function with a resilient self. Going back to the clay analogy, minority stress would be like putting our clay cells under a heat lamp out in the sun or under a hairdryer. Minority stress, which is enacted by our families, our friends, communities, cultures, and government, makes it harder for LGBTQ people to be resilient. And all of this almost inevitably leads to trauma, which is what I'd like to briefly discuss next. Trauma is when our stressors reach an overwhelming level and when our resiliency is incapable of allowing us to maintain cohesion of ourselves. It's when the clay crumbles. It's literally a fracturing or a falling apart of who we are. Psychologist Judith Herman, who I quoted earlier, states that trauma occurs when the normal systems of care that give us connection to others allow us to feel a sense of control over life and help us to make meaning in life, when those systems are fundamentally broken down. In the most commonly observed ways, trauma has been associated with threats to life, bodily integrity, and those encounters with violence and death. Those may well be triggering events for LGBTQ people because we face a much higher chance of encountering violence than a cisgender, heterosexual, European American male does. However, those stressors and resiliency are both factors. As an example, someone who has a supportive and loving family and community might be quite resilient. But if something terrible like a homophobic attack or the murder of a partner might be traumatizing to that person, no matter how resilient they are and how much support they have. Similarly, someone who has little support and therefore has a fragile and brittle sense of self could be traumatized by seemingly subtle or otherwise less objectively overwhelming events, like being mocked or excluded from a community. This means that when we come to traumatic events, some are more noticeable. They tend to be instantaneous and provoke crisis, whereas some traumatic events can be cumulative and more gradually break down our sense of safety, community, and agency. Here I want to briefly highlight a few items that are especially crucial for understanding trauma and resiliency for LGBTQ people, especially in the United States. With the prevalence of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric in our culture and constant debates over LGBTQ rights in our government, this widespread minority stress makes us more vulnerable to trauma because it's so difficult to build up a resilient self when the validity of our identities and relationships are constantly being called into question. We see this very clearly in actions by our government, where over 200 anti-transgender bills have been introduced in the United States in each state since the beginning of 2021. So that's in 5 months. Same-sex marriage was only legalized in the United States in 2015, only 6 years ago. And it remains a continuous issue, especially in conservative parts of our country. And there are a lot of those places. On top of all this, you needn't look far on social media to see hateful anti-queer comments or fundamentalist pastors who preach hate towards LGBTQ folks. I personally have a quote, "Don't read the comments" policy of self-care to avoid hearing and reading some of the terrible things that people say about queer and trans folks online. Seeing such things daily can be overwhelming and always leaves me feeling sad and angry. I know that a lot of what I've been talking about is heavy. It's difficult and might be insurmountable. But we really can do a lot to make a difference for LGBTQ people in our sanghas. And a lot of that involves learning, listening, and developing respect and love for LGBTQ folks. We all always have opportunities to learn and grow. And Jodo Shinshu has a lot to offer LGBTQ folks who are trying to find safety, to heal from trauma, and to make meaningful connections. Here are a few basic ways of helping when our Sangha is willing to make space for healing and expanding our community to deliberately be inclusive of LGBTQ people. The first involves listening and learning by practicing empathy. When we drop our assumptions about queer people and allow them to be their authentic selves, our hearts have the opportunity to grow and understand new ways of living life and experiencing joy and authenticity. Safety is also really important for LGBTQ people because we often face hatred and marginalization in our everyday lives. It's always important to continue growing. I've been in temples where people have told me they're very inclusive and that LGBTQ people are always welcome. Welcome at the temple. But being welcome isn't enough. It takes effort to be inclusive, which means to deliberately make changes to the temple's culture to ensure that LGBTQ people are involved in our activities, allowing us to share at the temple as we feel comfortable and to form affinity groups. Putting a rainbow flag up outside the temple can mean a lot. It shows that we're welcome in the temple. But we have a lot more to do than just putting up that flag. Token acts like that can be reinforced by creating safety and deliberate inclusion for LGBTQ people. Forming these new connections with our sanghas can be profoundly healing and might change our lives. I know that how I was treated at Berkeley Buddhist Temple did change my life. I don't think we all need to be trained in psychology or counseling to do this work. We all have our own unique skills and abilities, but if we open up ourselves to learning and growing and really listening to others, then we can live up to the ambition of having our temples be a refuge of safety for those who need it. I want to start wrapping all of this up by tying everything I've said to our teachings in a very clear way. Our founder, Shinran Shonin, wrote about the self in a very clearly religious way that can sometimes carry some difficult baggage when we're talking about care and affirming community for those who are marginalized. He presents the self in a soteriological religious context. That is, we're so tied up in our egos, our quote-unquote evilness and limitations. Shinran writes, although I take refuge in the true Pure Land way, it is hard to have a true and sincere mind. This self is false and insincere. I completely lack a pure mind. He then says, each of us in outward bearing make a show of being wise, good, and dedicated. But so great is our greed, anger, perversity, and deceit that we're filled with all forms of malice and cunning. While I think these passages are good reminders for those of us who live in relative security, that our egos can really get in the way when it comes to trying to doing good in the world. If we look at these statements from the perspective of LGBTQ people who are constantly being told that we're abominations, unnatural, evil, we are caricatures and stereotypes, too feminine or too masculine, too flamboyant, too loud, too colorful, or just wrong in so many other ways, then this message can feel pretty condemning. In Buddhism, though, we aren't perfect. We should still strive to act skillfully in life. And this might mean re-examining Shinran's perspective on the self and the intended audience. And I think that brings us back to the Buddhist concept of the middle path or moderation. Accepting our limited nature can also be a form of radical self-acceptance and positive evaluation. In a sense, this self-affirmation is a way of seeing ourselves and others in two ways at the same time. One is that we're struggling in life, and the second is that we're also worthy of love and care. Doctrinally, this comes from the Jodo Shinshu take on faith. In the chapter on faith in Shinran's major work, the Kyogyo Shinsho, he quotes Pure Land Master Shandao's description of the mind of deep faith. In my opinion, we could honestly summarize a lot of what it means to be Jodo Shinshu Buddhist in this passage. We will read it fully in a moment, but it basically states that there are two aspects of deep faith. One is that we're limited in our vision due to our own delusional and self-centered experiences of existence. And two is that faith, because of all this, we are grasped and never abandoned by the wisdom and compassion of Buddha. If we understand, at least in part, some of the struggles that queer people face from minority stress and the associated trauma that often develops as a result, then we can begin making steps in opening our heart towards LGBTQ people in our communities in profound and meaningful ways that hold the potential to help us all grow and heal together as a Sangha. This practice of deliberate inclusion must place a heavy emphasis from the Buddhist perspective of faith, and that is the inherent worth of LGBTQ people, that queer folks are the subject of Amida Buddha's wisdom and compassion. Part of this deliberate inclusion also requires us to closely examine ourselves, our temple communities, and the broader community and culture at large to see how we all contribute to narratives that exclude, devalue, and dehumanize LGBTQ people and our relationships. If we can honestly look in our own heart and find that we hold no hatred or assumptions about LGBTQ people, then we're at the point where we can begin to educate and help others as we all continue to do the work of rooting out LGBTQ phobia. Here I just wanted to share the passage that Shinran quotes regarding faith and the two aspects of deep mind. Deep mind is the deeply entrusting mind. There are two aspects. One is to believe deeply and decidedly that you're a foolish being of evil karma, caught up in birth and death, ever sinking and ever wandering in transmigration from innumerable kalpas in the past, with never a condition that would lead to emancipation. The second is to believe deeply and decidedly that Amida Buddha's 48 vows grasp sentient beings, and that allowing yourself to be carried by the power of the vow without any doubt or apprehension, you will attain birth. Here, Shinran's talking again about the very religious idea of faith, that it's incomplete without both aspects. If we live our lives believing that we're foolish and evil and nothing else, then what hope do we have that we'll ever experience joy? Will we be able to do good for others and for ourselves? If we're just evil, will we be able to grow, learn, and love? Likewise, if we get caught up only in the fact that Amida Buddha embraces us in wisdom and compassion, that we will ultimately be liberated, then it's easy to get caught up in our egos. We might even believe that it doesn't matter if we try to do good or bad, that we can treat people however we want, say whatever we want, without any real world consequences. Both of these mindsets might seem a bit contradictory, but true faith is incomplete without both sides. I decided to reframe this notion of faith in such a way that offers us some practical, real-world advice on how we can walk the Pure Land path in a way that will allow us to learn and grow and practice intentional inclusion in our temple community. The first aspect is that my perception, my reality, my truth is biased. Everything I hold as quote-unquote true and real is only a partial understanding of reality, which means that my perspective is usually centered on myself. I'm not perfect, nor am I 100% right. I make mistakes every day. All these things make me human. None of us is perfect, and that's why we suffer together. The second aspect is because of my imperfections, I need love and support and the viewpoints of others. I must find forgiveness, love, and acceptance for myself. The perspectives and wisdom of other people can help me grow and learn, and in turn, be more kind to myself and others. Listening is oftentimes more valuable and helpful than speaking. This notion of practical faith is something that can encourage me when I'm feeling down and hurt, and it can also challenge me when I feel like I know everything and everyone else is wrong. In Jodo Shinju, Faith is our ultimate goal, and Shinran says it's the most difficult thing to attain in our lives. Radical acceptance of ourselves and others will not be easy. And I think that if it seems to come easy to me, I will always interrogate if I'm really accepting. I'd like to end my Dharma message today, and once again, I appreciate the opportunity to share with you. Please join me in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda, Namanda, Namanda.